something.
You are listening to Red Team Radio.
Today on Red Team Radio, I have a former work colleague and a friend, Justin Wynn, also goes online with his handle Red Team Wins, which I am a real fan of, actually, that handle. Play on, of course, of your last name, so it's not WINS before anyone starts looking for it. Did you snag that handle as well, actually, or is that someone else's?
LinkedIn.com/in/Red Team.
All right.
Yeah, Red Team
there
Wins,
you go.
man.
So he is the director of one of the labs of Coalfire, and right, is that correct?
We've reorged 20 times. I'm not quite sure what the organization is, but I think we're going by Red Team nowadays.
Okay.
So director of Red Team.
Okay, director of Red Team. Sorry, it was. You can see I'm old Coalfire, right?
Because
I
20
used the word.
reorgs ago. It's understandable. It was 4 years ago since he's been with us.
So I obviously am using the old wording on that. But you've been on a bunch of projects. You've done red teaming for about 8 years now, right? A little bit over that. And you've had great successes in the field, and you've also experienced times where things didn't go quite as planned, right? Not every red team engagement goes exactly how we want it to go. And that's fine. We just adjust for that and we move forward with it. But tell me, with everything on red teaming, tell me some of the more exciting items that you've actually worked towards, or that you've been on, projects you've been on, something that just stands out and you're just like, yeah, that was like the real deal. I felt like James Bond throughout this project.
Yeah. No, great question. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the introduction. And super happy to talk about physical security, and just the war stories is like probably the greatest part of the job here, right? And like when we get to go on and like tell our kids or share this information with our industry, it's really special. So seriously, thank you for that. It does feel like almost every engagement, I mean, there's something that comes up that's just extraordinary. There's nothing, I don't think, that's ever mild or vanilla about it. So to showcase and pick a couple things, throughout the career, there's always the progression in learning new skills or edge case scenarios where something like goes wonderfully right and you had no idea that it could be done that way. And when you have like a new tool in your repertoire, and you do get to, like, whether it's a physical tool, the J-hook thumb bypass tool, the first time you use that, or an Adams right bypass driver for a hook latch is just, I mean, phenomenal. It's like, oh man, I practiced this in the lab, or maybe I haven't. I just bought the shiny new tool. But getting it deployed in the field, getting that open, right, which we're always super excited about. So shout out for Tool, always, right? There's plenty of exciting stories like that. And I think the big one for me that stands out, one of the top ones that comes to mind, is the first engagement I was ever on, which is water treatment facilities. So any critical infrastructure where the government has tons of money to blow on actually doing security right, and then you see just the shortfalls of implementation or human element behind things. It's always fascinating to see that, but also pretty intimidating, I think, from I had urban exploration as kind of my background before this, and it's also been a really cool thing for me, and maybe I should take a moment to thank my hacker fame. I came into this industry not knowing anything. It was after college. I graduated with a marketing degree. I'm like, shit, things are getting real. I had to figure out what I'm going to do for money, but I also want to be in a career that I'm passionate about. And that eventually led me down the road to physical security, entries and break-ins, and I was doing a lot of urban exploration at the time, and then found a job and a career that allowed me to exercise those demons in a professional, productive manner that helps improve the state of the world to some degree. Security isn't everything, but it's a really cool thing to be a part of. So going down that road, let's see, I guess the first engagement, water treatment facilities, getting to break into government-grade facilities. So going from nothing, urban exploration, who's this kid? I'm I was with a much more senior tester than I was at the time. His name's Dan. And I talk about this in some of my talks, but that engagement of, how we approach things and, kind of my perspective from being maybe street trained is, the way to say it, versus, the discipline of, being book trained and, what you can read online. So what you're saying about things being dynamic or changing or not going the way that you expect it to, the big takeaway for that was our initial approach on the first facility. Looking at the aerial images, Dan charted out a path, and I'm from Florida, and we're working in a part of the country that's pretty similar and swampy, and he's like, oh, we're going to take this route down here, circle around, and get in. I'm like, all right, man, Dan, that kind of looks pretty swampy. I mean, from Florida man, if there's one thing I know, like that's what we're looking at. That's a swamp. And why don't we take this route? Like it's a wide open field. So like obviously, yeah, much bigger concerns there. But maybe that's kind of the street smart type of thing to it, is understanding people aren't vigilant and on guard at the perimeter of the facility overlooking an empty field for like years on end, right?
Mm-hmm.
Waiting for the one day somebody comes up and approaches things, right? Which also there's a huge segue in there about testing in a natural, typical environment rather than alerting your security team and having them, be in hyper vigilant states for that week while you're there and making it artificial, right? It's killer. Happens and there's use cases for it, but typically, no, we like it normal. Just testing normal. If that's normal state, go for it. So we're looking at things. I'm like, man, let's just go across the field. We can like waltz right up, go in the back door, no problem. We go Dan's route. I defer. He's more senior, and this is my first official live engagement for corporations. Huge for me. So I'm like, all right, we're going to do it your way. So we get on site, we park, we hop into that swamp, we hop the fence, and I have a wonderful picture of him too. So this is another thing too. Like maybe I was naive or cavalier about things, but I also wanted to report fodder, things we can throw in the report. And I took a flash photo of him in the woods, which of course it illuminates everything. Like for miles away, like I get you. Line of sight from where it was to the facility we're working on. We're like 2 miles out at that point. I didn't think it was a concern. Turned out not to be, and that can go either way. So take what you want out of it. We do that. Hop the fence, and we're in the swamp. I mean, splash, touchdown. So, if you're worried about being overt, it's the footsteps that'll give you away the entire time, too. It had to be 3 or 4 hours to go those 2 miles. I mean, crawling, hugging, staying low. And there was a military base nearby, and then the jets were flying overhead. And every time a jet passed over, we were able to book it and make a little bit of headway and go that route. Still took us 4 hours later, and we get to the back gate, which is wide open. After seeing everything else pretty secure throughout the facility, we get in there and then just carte blanche, able to do everything that we needed to on site. We ended up hitting that facility twice. When we came back the next time, we did it my way. We took the open field and just 20 minutes, walked right in the facility, did everything we need to. So
and you're dry, right? So it's not odd if someone sees you.
Right, exactly. So I mean that's it to me in a nutshell. Things going to plan or deviating or changing course while you're live and on site, but that had to be one of the funnest experiences going on an engagement like that and seeing that facility for the first time. I mean, places I think as like an urban explorer, you experience some abandoned places like that, but to see it live and running and like the show and works and dodging live people, but still having your bulletproof vest, that get out of jail free card, and like, hey, are we going to use it? How's that go? And then some people in the industry at that time too had an ego, and this is what I've been hearing before I got on site for that engagement was, I've never been caught before. I never had to use my get out of jail free card. And nowadays, after being more mature in our role, I'm dead set the opposite for 2 reasons. One is, what a wonderful inoculation for yourself as a tester to have that get out of jail free card and talk your way through it, see when you really do need to produce that, or if you can get in that confrontation and talk your way out of it and never have to deploy it. But if you were an urban explorer, you never go up, you never try that route, typically and generally speaking, right? And then the alternative, I think, for the client, too, is you need to establish that baseline. So it's not just owning them and making yourself look good and having all this cool report fodder and saying, hey, here's how we blew open the doors and everything was totally insecure. You also need to throw the client a bone and say, this is what did work. And after you go in covert, I like to raise my level of ridiculousness almost and get to a point where the client does detect us. And sometimes you have to get crazy ridiculous, but we need to identify and establish that baseline so then the client understands, all right, this is where we're at. Here's all the room for improvement. So sorry, probably a long-winded answer for what you're looking for. That's why we have these videos that we can cut down and shave down the presentation.
I love it.
Cool.
I love it. No need to cut it down. It was great. So when you're going on this first engagement, that sound like the first time you went through the swamp, you're doing it at nighttime, right?
Yep.
And now today, with your experiences and many successful engagements underneath your belt, do you prefer to go into a building, let's say, during business hours or during nighttime? Like, what is your preferred entry time?
Yeah. Yeah, and thanks for saying that. It's totally preferred. I think that's up to each individual tester, right? I
Mm-hmm.
love going in at night, getting the lay of the land, understanding how things work. I mean, you can still feel the environment and the office buzz even at night and understand how, like, the relationships between coworkers or their role in the organization even at night. And that's just, I mean, I think partly for safety for us, partly so you have a successful engagement. My biggest fear is the client pays whatever we're charging nowadays, or the rates that we all get in this industry for a client to send 2 consultants on site for a week can be $10, $20, $30,000
Mm-hmm.
easy. I would hate to fly on site and then get burned right away and then just blacklisted from the
Right.
facility, right?
Yep.
So for me, that helps introduce more control and understanding of what we're getting into. Then the next day, I'll come on site during the day, do the social engineering. And there's also advantages to that, too, for being able to come on later at night. Say a building locks down over time after hours, right? But during the day, you have public access and you can tape up a latch, preferably inside where you're not exposing a vulnerability to the outside world for everyone.
Yep.
But making sure you have more leveled approaches and, it makes things a little bit different. So my personal methodology: come in on site, get the lay of the land, exploit, and you can really capture just about everything and be able to get in and out that way. I think delivers a lot of impact and value to the client and helps us be a little bit safer, and then give them a fuller engagement. Then we can go on site the next day and have more of an idea for a social engineering pretext, because I think what you wanted to ask about too is the trade-off that we have versus attackers that have, no time constraints and can work on this for a year, versus we're on site for 1 week and we have no time for surveillance and getting the lay of the land first.
Yeah, and that's the reality of like the commercial work, right? Is you have a fixed time for the project. The client doesn't have unlimited money.
Right.
So we have to make sure that we fit into the particular scope that they're looking to do within, within their budget. And sometimes that means that we have to be light on surveillance, right? So instead of doing, 2 months of surveillance, we have to do 2 hours of surveillance,
right
before we get in. And the client themselves, that even if you try to explain to them like, oh, it'd be much better if you paid for 2 extra days, they'd be like, wait, so I'm going to pay for 2 extra days for you to sit in a car and look at us? Like, what? And the clients that get it, right? That there are some clients that are just like, oh, totally understand. Like, yeah, you need extra days to do surveillance. Bam, have an extra week, right? But there are, especially when it comes to the physical aspect, there are many clients that are like, okay, we're going to have you break in just so we can show you that you did that. We need to secure our facility, but we also want you to then break into our network, right? So we want to spend more time on the breaking on the network part than we do breaking on the building part,
Sure.
right? And then there's other clients where it's the opposite, where they're like, we want to know everything wrong with our building. Like, once we know that you're into our building, we understand you can get into our network.
Right.
And but I always find that interesting, the client's idea or their thoughts on what it looks like when you have, a set period of time, and they just think that, oh, everything can be done. We have 3 facilities. You have 3 days. Yeah, sure, the facilities are in different states, but yeah, that should be enough time, right? Like, we can get everything in there. And it's just, it turns out that you can't a lot of times. So you have to work with those clients. But has there ever been a project where you have just been told, hey, you need to make entry and you have no time for recon. Your recon's going to be done on site, and you have 3 days to do this entire project?
Oh yeah, that's pretty much every engagement. I think I really
You need to talk to your salespeople.
Yeah. Oh, truly, and we're trying to rework that. And still on site's expensive, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the default for us, which isn't great, and it definitely creates a little bit of tension for the tester, right, to be successful with it, to go on site and knock it out of the park. When you have 3 days for 3 facilities, it's like, man, this would be a 2-month job for any legit organization, or even a criminal, or some government like trying to infiltrate this facility, whatever it is. There's always a lot more time in play there. And so I see this, to relate it to a virtual red team engagement that we have recently. There's a client, and I think that's as you become more mature in the industry, doing your job a little bit better and understanding the client's perspective and your perspective, and then seeing how you guys need to merge and work together on that. I had a client recently who balked at the idea of giving us the IPs for us to target during the test, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is fine, because a lot of people need to understand what you're able to find out through OSINT and go online and find and attack those assets that way. And I just need to make sure that I reiterate to them, that's okay. But an attacker, they're going to have all the time in the world to do this, and that recon and that enumeration. What we do in a constrained situation for 1 week, I hate to spend your money, us just crawling the internet and looking for those kind of details, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's back and forth, and you need to confirm the scope and say, yes, these are all our assets, please proceed. So the trade-off of what a real-world adversary has versus us on a condensed timeline, once we communicate that to the client, it'll oftentimes change the dynamic. However, I mean, there's still the clients that want that perspective. They say, nope, give us realistic. If it's black box and that's all you can find, go for it. And then a lot of times, I mean, just that constraint, because even at that point, it's almost unreal in the other swing of the direction that the attacker would always have more time than that. So it's just hamstringed, and we don't get the testing results that we're looking for. So communicating that to the client is kind of the difference between consultants and seniors. You remember that when you're at Coalfire, it's all the soft skills there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And now, have you ever been on a project doing some type of covert entry and the client was just maybe the point of contact was very for the project, but the rest of the team at the client site was very anti it, and they just tried to make your life harder than it needed to be?
That'll happen quite a bit. So there's always varying stakeholders or perspectives, right? And maybe your point of contact is looking for leverage and budget from the C-suite. And we see this all the time. A lot of times we'll work with a point of contact who understands and knows there's issues.
Yep.
And they have been so hamstringed in their environment that they're not able to get the budget or the funding or backing to come in, or the downtime to come in and secure that facility properly. And they'll ask us, hey, come on site, please demonstrate this so the C-suite understands the impact of a physical compromise and how easy it is, and then how crippling it can be to the organization. And then, of course, the C-suite thinks, hey, we're secure, or why are we paying these security people big money if it's not actually secure? So you do see conflicting interests like that quite a bit. On the physical side of things, I've been on engagements where a client, would just come in year after year, and we win, unfortunately, and we keep showing them these issues, and they remediate, and then just in the red team exercises, we find a new path of least resistance, and they'll introduce additional constraints saying, hey, don't lock pick. Anybody can pick a lock, right? Show us what you can do with lock bypassing, which is honestly typically what we're doing more on site than anything else anyways.
Right.
95% of the time, I'll try to bypass or find another way through the barrier that I'm trying to get through before I resort to lockpicking for a number of reasons. One being pretty terrible picker, but two, also it's super overt, right? Like it burns a lot of your cover. If you're down there like with tools, with picks, it reduces your limits, your ability to be able to talk yourself out of that situation versus if you have a cardboard folder or a cutting board and you're just shimming that through. Hey man, I saw this, I'm late for work, just trying to get through this door or whatever, left my badge inside.
Right.
Things like that.
Yeah, and that's the other thing is, there's metrics that sometimes in the public sector we always are measuring them, but in the private sector we don't always measure it, like time on lock, right?
Yeah.
So picking is a very laborious process.
Sure.
And it is a lot of time on lock. And someone would be like, well, I'll be able to get through that lock in 10 seconds. It's like, great, but can you bypass it in 3? So what you're telling me is you're doing a 3x multiple on a particular lock. And that's a 3x multiple. That's going to add up over time. You're giving someone 7 additional seconds to spot what you're doing.
It's exposure in multiple ways, right? Like one is, actually the time on target, time on lock, which is a new term that I've heard. But then also, the overtness, the tools that you're using. There's some stuff that's inconspicuous and innocent, and somebody just trying to jiggle a door or work with a rec sensor, and that's a lot different than having specialized tools to attack that target. Right. It changes the dynamic.
Yeah. Now, have you ever had a client that is wanting to join you on an engagement?
Yes, those are the best clients too, and we have so much fun with that. So we started doing something new too, like more whitelist walkthroughs, audits, something like that you guys have been doing for years, and it was a new concept for Coalfire that got introduced, for good reason. And that's a lot easier to be able to meet with the client first, go on site, shake hands, train them, like just talk about things, get the gears moving around physical security, and then get them on target, bypassing door with an under the door tool. And it takes 30 seconds, and somebody's trained up, and the look on their faces when they get that door open is
the
unbelievable.
First door, and then they just, because the gears start clicking, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I can do this to this door now, right? And a door that you didn't even know about that has like some extreme importance there.
Sure, right. That they know, and they know the facility, and they can walk us through, and it's so much easier for everyone, and they're having fun, and they're learning. And so you do have the high-speed, hardcore clients like that that are very tuned into the technology and security. And I think maybe even the greater part of it is when you have a client who's just totally clueless and be like, hey, man, I have a ton of budget. I know we know nothing about physical security or security in general. Can you come on site and teach us? And then just, man, the way their jaws are dropped. It's an eye-opening experience, I think, for most civilians or muggles, whatever you refer to people who aren't in the industry, right? When they come through and see how easy it is to pick a master lock, and they're like, this is what I rely on my boat trailer for. I have a $50,000 boat secured with this $10 piece of hardware that can be bypassed or picked in 5 seconds. And it just changes people's mindset. And I think that's so important for the industry because it's how we drive change from the manufacturers of these products, right? And the more that we make educated decisions as consumers, either in our own lives or for our corporation, I think that's how we make meaningful impact and change over time.
Yeah, totally going to steal the term lock muggle now.
Lock muggle. I like it's even better. The compound term yet. Let's go for it. Let's make this industry standard.
Yeah, that's right.
Please.
We need to get it accepted. But like NIST needs to
Yes,
use that
yes.
in one of their standards. Now,
Yes.
who do we know at NIST that can make this happen?
We
Right?
got contacts.
And then have you, as I drink my bourbon, as I'm asking my question, clearly
You're
a
in good
professional.
company.
Clearly a professional. Have you ever gone to a project where you've ever felt? I know I've felt this way before on a project, but you did great work, but you don't think that the impact that your report should have had is actually going to have that impact on that client.
Yeah, in physical's a little bit different. Usually when you're on site for a physical engagement, there's been a lot of need. There was an incident. There was some driver that
Right.
led that to happen. Very rarely is it just happenstance. Hey, we had excess budget
money,
and
yeah.
we saw, physical security is a thing. Let's do it. Virtually, I think that happens all the time where they're
Right.
checking the box. Let's just make this happen. And it's very unfortunate for the person who's passionate about it in that position at their company that wants to see these changes implemented, and they're not able to make that happen. Physically, I think it still has happened. I think more often than not, and this is kind of weird, this is rare in security, I think, that people will go out afterwards and take that report to heart and go to town and fix everything. And they have the ability to do so and the buy-in from whatever stakeholders are there, right? So physical security, I don't know. I think that's less of an issue. Virtually, I think it happens all the time, but
Yeah.
it still happens in both.
I definitely feel like if they're doing a physical, rarely. I think I've only been on 1 or 2 projects where I was helping out another company, and they were doing the physical because they had like 2 extra days that they could do something, and then
Oh, cool.
the salesperson was like, "Oh, we could do a physical." I was just like, "Well, not really in 2 days."
Right.
Right, and they're just contracting us out for
Right.
those 2 days, right? It's not like one of my salespeople said that. But on the virtual side, definitely. I mean, one of the things that I came up with that a lot of people, I guess, now use or borrow is, that's out of scope, said no attacker ever.
Saw that shirt today.
I know.
It's popular.
It's
Accurate.
It is accurate. And so the story behind it, not to bag on Coalfire clients, was actually, it happened during a meeting with Coalfire where someone was just like, okay, you found all these high findings, and they literally said, we actually don't care about that result. We just care about the minimum cost to get these down to medium.
Yeah.
And I was just like, well, don't you want to address it? And they said, well, no, we don't need to like address the problem. We just needed to get down to a medium.
Mm.
I was like, oh, okay, yeah. So it's like, then you get like 90 days to work on the problem. And they're like, no, we're going to leave them as a medium. And I was just like, okay. And then I was like, okay, well, what about these systems that, like you can't leave them as mediums? And they're like, oh, that wasn't supposed to be in scope, actually. So we're going to not have that.
Can you remove that from the report entirely?
Exactly.
We get that all the time.
Exactly.
Sure.
And I was just like, yeah, that's out of scope. Said no attacker ever.
Right.
Like, and it was just crazy that was like their approach.
Yeah.
And luckily, and I think in the physical world, and this is one of the things I really enjoy, and you kind of hit on it with the physical world, is rarely do you have a happenstance project.
Right.
You don't have a
It's
checkbox
very intentional
project.
and purposeful.
It's very intentional. People are excited on the other side.
Yeah.
Now, there might be people who aren't excited as well on the other side, right? So if it's the digital team that's going and requesting a physical, the physical security team themselves might feel like, hey, I don't want you to like do this,
Of
right?
course,
There's
that's
no
your
reason.
baby, and you got to go in there and
Yeah.
tell them their baby is ugly.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. Telling
course.
people's baby they're ugly. It's my
Doesn't go
number
over
one thing
well.
that I do.
I remember that. I use that line a lot. Thank you for that.
No
Yeah.
problem.
I think the other one too that I hear all the time is we accept the risk, right? And so I think there's a lot of dangers to compliance-driven testing that we see, obviously, in the industry. At the same time, so much of the stuff wouldn't have gotten tested where it is. So, good and bad, or
it's definitely the positive and negatives of the world. And there's an ability to accept some risk, right? But if the answer is always, I accept this risk, and it's just like, you can't accept this risk on all these findings. Like, you can accept these risks on, let's say 10% of these findings, right? But you can't accept the risk on 100 findings out of a 32 finding report.
Yeah.
Right? And it's just like, come on, you have to do a little bit better with that. And that's actually one of the things I love about running my own company, is I can tell those clients, like, all right, you have 1 strike. You get 2 more strikes, and you are not a client of ours.
Yeah, no, that's going to be great to be able to pick and choose. And I think Kevin Mitnick was big on that too, about, selecting the clients when you have that book of sales, just saying, this is like fun work. That's what I want to do. And people that are passionate about it. And I think almost anyone in the industry would agree. We'd rather work with a client who's, doesn't have the budget, but they're so passionate and they have a need, whether it's for active shooters or like whatever proactive response that we can introduce by securing them a little bit further. I would much rather work with that client than the guy who has $1 million and they don't care and it's not going to get fixed. That's the point.
Yeah. And no one's going to look at the report, right? Until a breach happens.
Right.
And then the investigators will be like, who wrote this report?
Well, that's a big part of the industry too, I think, is checking that box, like one for compliance, but also for insurance, right? So we have a client right now who has a new guy in place and healthy budget, but it feels like a checkbox situation where it's like, we are dedicating resources to a SOC solely so we are meeting the benchmark baselines that insurance will pay out when we get popped, right?
Yeah, and then they learn that insurance believes that we're in World War III, so they don't pay off insurance claims during war times.
Yeah, being in Florida during hurricanes, I also experienced this on a personal basis.
Yeah, exactly.
Not a big fan of the insurance companies.
Yeah. For people that have cyber insurance, make sure you really read your policies, because we've dealt with 2 clients where insurance didn't pay out.
Really?
Because of situations where they're like, this was an act of God, and it's like, getting breach is not an act of God. Right?
That's the claim they try to make. Huh? I would love to pick your brain. Your thoughts about insurance, because it's a big thing for.
Yeah, it was a very
industry,
nuanced
that
thing.
I know nothing about.
Yeah, it was a very nuanced item that like kind of fell around that realm because of like during the time that it happened, and that like, this particular item failed because this utility went out. And then so it defaulted back to this other fallback system that wasn't actually configured to the standard that it was wanting, or that they should have had it to, but it still would have been covered under insurance. But because this natural disaster caused this failover event to happen, like they were fighting this, and it's actually an ongoing thing still.
Oh man, it must be nice to work like as an insurance agent, just never have to pay out and come up with these crazy excuses.
That's right.
Why not, right?
Yeah.
It's an act of God. No, it's not. It's an act of IT, man. That's how followers work.
I mean, that's why insurance companies have all this money, right? They
Crazy,
just they accept the premiums, but they never pay out, right? That's why I always tell people that are just like, oh, if you had 1 day to live, would you just hack a bank? I'm like, hell no. I'd hack insurance companies.
Because they deserve it too, even more than the banks, which, man, if you're really taking stock, that says something.
I wasn't even going to that level. I was just like, these are the companies that don't even care if you transfer $50 million.
Yeah, they're ready for it.
Yeah,
they already got it like, ready to lose.
There you go. Yeah, so now in the plethora of red team, tools that are specific to red teaming, right? Is there any one particular tool that you just love and you're like, yeah, this is my go-to jam? Or if you can't think of just one, can you name 3? And not in any particular order, but like, these 3 tools are my jam. And I can give you an example.
No, it's a great. Well, go ahead, because I think it's a great question. I probably have my top 3 that I could rattle off, but yeah.
Like, probably always in my top 3 is going to be under the door tool, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it has to be, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just ADA compliance and like the trade-off between like security and, availability and things like that. It's always so at play, unless you get in the hardcore facilities that you get to work in that I don't have a lot of fun with, not cleared or anything like that. But there's some fun stuff that happens.
You can come in there,
Okay, all right, sure. OPSEC failures, no problem. Invite the civilian. Like, I'll be the muggle in that situation.
I'm a civilian.
All right.
I'm boring.
No. You got a colorful history, man. So, yeah, I mean, as far as I feel like picks need to be mentioned, and it's really almost not on my list, but like it's important to recognize how versatile they are. And like with a proper set of picks and single picking, you can get through any and every door out there, right? And that's important to recognize. Putting that aside and focusing just on bypass, number one, it's going to be a latch bypass tool. So Sparrow's Hall Pass, always in your wallet, always should be. Along with a folded piece of plastic, whether it's full-size cutting board, and be able to just attack that latch from the other direction or snake around the bend of the frame, right? UDT, under the door tool, K22, does anybody actually use that term anymore?
Yeah.
All of those are going to be absolutely probably number one, number two. And it's funny because I think any tool in our industry we can source anywhere in the world at your local Ace Hardware or whatever it is, with the one exception being RFID tools. And that needs some specialized hardware. And so if you want to throw that in the mix, I think you're capable to take down any facility that exists, right? And then specifically, we'd be talking something like the Proxmark for badge cloning, reading, writing, but then also the implants. Man, that ESP key, and you just pop off the reader and hook that in because everything's still in clear text for 99% of the situations, applications. And that's what blew my mind once I realized that you can have a retina scan, multi-factor authentication with your badge, something you have, something you are. And then as soon as that hits the wire and goes over, it's all in clear text, and you just hook in there and replay that. It doesn't matter what eye color you have. You're in, man. You're James Bond at that point.
And it is definitely, the ESP key is definitely the tool that makes me feel most like James Bond.
Yeah, it's got to be. It's got to be. I mean,
though James Bond's a terrible spy, he'd be a terrible spy if he was a real spy, because everyone knows him, right? Like he goes over to the country and the hotel, front desk.
I know the exact scene you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
100%.
Hello, Mr. Bond. It was just
with Daniel Craig. Yeah. Bond. Yeah.
But it's the ESP key, definitely. I mean, it's I think the ESP key, dollar for dollar, is mind blowing to clients, because they just spent, we've seen clients spend $10,000 on a long range iris reader,
right? And
they're like, this is the jam, right? Like, this reads your iris, and then the door will unlock because we have it working with cameras as well, right when you get to the door, and it works great. And it's just like, right, so you're using WeGAN on the back end. So now I'm going to buy this $75 tool online that anyone can buy and put it onto your device. And now we're going to walk up to this door, and it's going to let us in.
Man, and how burned does the client feel spending all the money? It's the most futuristic thing you could ever imagine, right? And then it still talks clear text on the back end. And that's where we step in. That's our role, exposing and illuminating that, saying there are better options available. Let's get you using one of those until we find out all the issues with, what is it, OSDB?
OSDP.
OSDB. And then only part of the packets are encrypted, or there's still attacks you can do on it, and different configurations where it's not working properly. However, as the client, I think, again, going back to what we demand from the manufacturers and installers, having better hardware available for them and exposing the insecurities, and thus we can make everything more secure, hopefully.
Now, have you ever had a vendor or a manufacturer get angry at your reports? So you're testing, let's say you're testing a utility company, and they're using, products from different vendors, right? That's not in-house products. And then you submit a report, and then the vendor is like, hey, we need to talk, because that client submitted that information to that vendor.
Sure. I mean, I think it happens. It kind of comes down to processes, like where we are involved in that process. Once we hand off the report to the client, they're going to be looking at different things. We're not always involved in those conversations. I do hear it happens, and it makes sense. That's the vendor. That's their money. They work with that client. They don't want to lose their sale. And like a lot of the things in our industry, we're not trying to lose people's sales or jobs either. If we come through and social engineer a receptionist, and she lets us in because she's being, a kind human and not necessarily following the procedures, or maybe they don't have them and it's not upfront to them, the company may look back and be like, all right, well, we need to get rid of this receptionist since she let you guys in. Absolutely not. That's the only person in your industry or in your corporation that has that training, and she's going to be the best person and watchdog to prevent that from happening in the future. So same deal with vendors. A lot of times for them, I think it comes down to education and not really knowing what they're selling or what they're installing, or like a retina scanner, they think it's cutting edge, and the configurations, they just need a little bit more education about it. So spinning in the positive mindset, still trying to keep those relationships alive, I think is also very important.
Have you ever had a vendor that tried to sue Coalfire or tried to sue you?
I got my fair share of cease and desist letters. Been arrested once, can't say twice, hopefully never. But yeah, I mean, it happens all the time, and Masterlock's notorious like that, right? So if we're talking physical security, talk about a vendor who, if you disclose a vulnerability and they send you a cease and desist or threaten to sue you because you found this and you're trying to make this public light, so they can install a 5-cent piece and then completely remediate that vulnerability, and they refuse to, they'd rather prosecute. I think that's an issue. So I welcome them at that point. Let's fight it out.
Yeah, there was a lock manufacturer, and I was talking to them, one of their higher ups, and I asked them, "Hey, why don't you implement this fix?" And they were bluntly honest with me. They're like, "That would cost about 2.5 cents per lock." I was like, "Man, that's a great return."
This was Master Lock. If anyone doesn't know, it has to be. There's nobody else that cheap in the industry. Sorry, I have no idea who it is. Full disclosure.
I'm not naming any names. I don't have a.
It sounds like Master Lock if I had to guess.
If you had to put a bet on it, right? Since we are in Las Vegas, I would not bet against you.
Okay.
And they're like, yeah, it's like 2.5 cents per lock.
And at volume, like McDonald's model, right? Like, I get it. Makes sense.
And I was just like, yeah, that's great. That's like a huge return. And they're just like, oh no, we've put it before, and they've told us no.
Well, going back to that influence that we have as security researchers, right? And as consumers, if all the consumers at that point know, because it's just ignorance at that point, they are selling a shoddy product that consumers have no idea what's better or not.
Right.
If we educate those consumers and say, cost them nothing, would you be willing to pay 3 more cents for the lock you're already paying $100 for it to actually be secure? Hell yeah, everyone's going to say yes.
Yeah.
Of course, the executives aren't. They're trying to cut costs, and that's where we have the economics at play, that we have a little bit of influence there.
Yeah, and I think that is part of our job, is to explain to the higher ups and the bean counters why this cost, even if it is a large cost, is worth it. What is their true return on investment for it, right? And though we were bagging on insurance companies beforehand, one thing I have found that like cyber insurance has really illuminated is companies now look at it. If you can tell them like this is going to, or you can show them that this is going to reduce a premium cost for every year that you have to pay your premium for insurance, they'll be more on board to like jump onto that, and they'll be like, oh, this is going to save us, even if the implementation is going to cost them like $120,000 to fix. And they're like, oh, it's going to save us $20,000 a year on our cyber insurance. Great, because in 5 years or in 6 years we're going to recoup that. Right.
Got to speak the same language. Dollar bills, y'all.
That's right. Dollar bills. Right. Yeah, and I think that in the industry also separates really good like technicians in the industry and really good versus people who are good but not as good at those individuals in the field of covert entry. But they can break it down to a level that a board member can understand it, right? And it clicks for them. Because once it clicks for them, then that's going to be part of daily conversation on other things that they're talking about.
Yeah. No, 100%. I mean, I think you see that in the industry at large, so inclusive of cybersecurity as well. It's not how good of a hacker you are. You really need to be good to your fellow hacker, right? It's the hacker community and family, but then also being able to communicate and relay these issues to whatever team on the client side. And if you can't do that, but you're amazing, it doesn't really matter. I mean, you can still have impact, but it's not going to go as far if you are a medium hacker and you're able to really deliver that in, to a 5-year-old or, to a CISO.
Right.
Not that they're the same person.
Well, what's the difference? They're the same picture.
True. Sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah. But yeah, and I think that in itself is really sometimes get overlooked on by hackers. It's as I tell consultants that I work with and consultants that I hire, I always tell them they expect you to get in. Getting in is not the impressive part for them. Being able to demonstrate and correctly, word it in such a way that it makes sense to not just that engineer that you're talking to, but to that higher up, or that middle management person as well. Because a lot of times I've seen, especially now with, clients being more restrictive with budget, it's middle managers that are locking down and be like, I didn't see the value in this.
Sure.
Right? And if you can explain it to that middle management person, then they can also be champions for you when it comes to the time of you're explaining it to the higher ups. And I found that some people, they don't like the idea of like, oh, they expect me to get in. And I was like, yeah, that's why they're paying you, because they know that you can break into it. But can you explain it in such a way that it's going to add value and enact change to the organization?
Yeah, I really like that.
Yeah.
That's where I see it.
Thank you for tuning in to Red Team Radio. Don't forget to like this episode, hit subscribe, and follow for more. Craving extra Red Team Radio exclusives? Dive deeper at redteamradio.net and click support for early episode releases and members-only content. Join us twice a month as we continue to unveil the unseen in the Red Team Chronicles. Remain vigilant and do not cease to be curious.